Welcome to the finale of today's symposium. I'm Josh Brown, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Social History Project Center for Media and Learning, and on the History faculty at the City University Graduate Center. The American Social History Project actually is, to my shock, is hitting its 35th year this year. So I guess we're venerable now. And my research work has been pretty much on the 19th century illustrated press. Project I'm working on now is on the visual culture of the Civil War. And let me just join with everybody else in, first of all, thanking Bard. And in particular, I want to thank co-conveners, David and Kathy. And over the 35 years of the American Social History Project, I've done a lot of collaborations, for better or for worse, and this is one of the really better ones. It was been just, I guess I wouldn't have mentioned it if it had been bad. I would not have mentioned it, but. And also, of course, I want to thank today's presenters for really making bringing in the substance of today's symposium. This session of today's symposium is devoted to photography and portraiture, which are two mainstays in the scholarship of 19th century visual culture. But the presentations we'll hear and, of course, see consider some of the rituals and social and political uses and abuses of the medium and genre, and how they operated in extraordinary as well as everyday circumstances. So I'd like to introduce right away the two presenters. The first presenter is Matthew Fox Amato, who will discuss Civil War iconoclasm. Matt is currently an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Modeling Interdisciplinary Inquiry Program at Washington University in St. Louis. He received his BA from Harvard and PhD in history, with a certificate in visual studies from the University of Southern California in 2013. He's now completing a book manuscript entitled Slavery, Photography, and the Birth of Modern Visual Politics in America, which explores the relation between the rise of photography and the politics of slavery in the United States. It's based on his dissertation, which was the runner-up for the Southern Historical Association's 2014 C. Van Woodward Dissertation Prize, and a winner of the 2014 McNeil Center Zuckerman Prize, awarded to the best dissertation connecting American history with literature and/or art. Annie Rudd will then present Posing a Problem, Studio Portraiture, the Objects of Photography and the Pursuit of Genuine Likeness, 1839 to 1900. Annie is a core lecturer and faculty fellow at Columbia University. She received her BA at the University of Toronto and her PhD in communications from Columbia in 2014. As of this July, she will be an assistant professor in the University of Calgary's Department of Communication, Media, and Film. Her book project, currently in progress, is entitled The Posed and the Candid, and examines practices of posing and self-representation but I guess representation is part of it too, in 19th century portrait photography, and traces the emergence of an aesthetics and a politics of photographic candor in the early 20th century. So without any further ado, Matt.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Josh, and I want to reiterate the thanks to Kathy and David for putting this all together. It's been really wonderful so far, and thank you as well to the Bard Graduate Center for hosting us. I want to begin by considering what's really a typical commonplace if you will, item in the visual culture of the Civil War era, which is a photographic carte de visite of Abraham Lincoln taken in 1860. Though Lincoln might not have been the most photographed person in the 19th century, John Stauffer has a recent book that shows that it was actually Frederick Douglass, he still left behind numerous images, including many photographs. One approach to understanding the history of this image might delve into the conditions of production, unearthing more about the studio, the photographer, about Lincoln's perspective regarding sitting for this portrait. Another approach might foreground the visual elements of the image. This approach might consider the significance of Lincoln's gaze, his clothing, his stance. It might explore how the image draws upon broader conventions, highlighting the frequently employed pillar in the background as well as the book, which is a common symbol of literacy and intellect in mid-19th century portraiture. But in keeping with the theme of this symposium, I want to take a different path, one that foregrounds not production or aesthetics, but instead the materiality of Civil War images and the emotional and even hostile reactions they triggered. Lincoln's likeness surely provoked many emotional reactions. While the image was mass marketed by E.T. Anthony of New York, this particular carte de visite was held by Mary Chestnut, the famed Civil War diarist. Like many Americans during the 1860s, Chestnut took part in the broader carte de visite rage by compiling her own photo album. Like many albums of the period, Chestnut's mixed the extraordinary with the ordinary. You find pictures of family members alongside images of celebrities and politicians, images of Confederate leaders, too. Chestnut's album, when combined with her detailed diary, offers us a rare window into the material practices that surround Civil War carte de visite, for she occasionally described the pictures she bought or received, as well as those moments in which she shared her album with acquaintances. In July of 1862, she recorded one such exchange, and it's particularly illuminating when we're thinking about Lincoln's portrait. And here's what she says. Our small colonel, Paul Haynes' son, came into my room. To amuse the child, I gave him a photograph album to look over. You have Lincoln in your book. I'm astonished at you. I hate him. That's the child. And he placed the book on the floor and struck old Abe in the face with his fist. So while the vision of a small Southern boy pounding Lincoln's surrogate face might seem of minor significance in comparison to engravings found on the pages of Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, to the well-known battlefield photographs of Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner, or to the many lithographs that circulated during the war, I think we would do well to view this child's hot-blooded response as one part of a broader and largely unstudied cultural phenomenon, the iconoclastic impulses of the war. Today I want to trace a few dimensions of this wartime iconoclasm, which I'll define broadly as physical violence enacted upon images. Written records such as diaries, letters, newspapers, and memoirs demonstrate that many social groups, from northern soldiers to southern whites to even enslaved people, engaged in different forms of iconoclasm. What did it mean for northern soldiers to steal and slice the private portraits they encountered in southern households? How do we begin to understand dramatic moments, which I'll talk about in a little bit, in which enslaved people took pictures from their masters' homes, defaced those images, and then hung them on their own cabin walls? What can these and other iconoclastic acts tell us about the political and cultural role of images in this moment? My talk will address these questions, and since this is actually the first time I've presented this material, it's a new project for me. I'm really eager to hear your comments. I've divided my talk in two parts. First, I'll explore the iconoclastic practices of Union soldiers before turning to assess, though briefly, how bondspeople are also engaged in acts of iconoclasm against their owners. I want to conclude by suggesting how the focus on iconoclasm stands to shed new light on the history of visual culture in the Civil War era. So during and after the war, in unpublished and published letters, diaries, and memoirs, Southern whites told stories about pictures. Since much Union iconoclasm took place in the Southern household, white women are the most vocal narrators of image destruction. They describe their efforts upon news of an imminent Yankee arrival to move their pictures, along with a number of other, along with many other prized possessions, really, to safer locations. They vividly recounted dramatic moments in which Northern troops defaced and absconded with family pictures. Collectively, their records illuminate how Union men targeted both public and private images, both mass-produced pictures as well as unique paintings. This Union image destruction was built upon Southern image consumption. As art and cultural historians have shown, many slaveholders held an aristocratic appetite for landscape paintings and painted portraits, which they used to decorate the walls of their lavish urban townhomes and plantation estates. In doing so, the walls of the big house, in other words, they became ripe targets for Northern bayonets. Once the war began, moreover, Southerners increasingly complemented their consumption of art with nationalistic, mass-reproducible images. Along with a set of visual symbols that included the new Confederate seal, which pictured George Washington on his horse, Southerners propped up their new pro-slavery nation by circulating and consuming photographs of political leaders and generals, especially Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, General Beauregard, and later Robert E. Lee. Southern consumers like Mary Chestnut, who I just talked about, are putting these images in their photo albums, which is a common practice at the time, but limited evidence suggests that Confederate sympathizers also found more creative and even aggressive ways to use popular pictures. Here's one instance. In Baltimore, in June of 1861, as the New York Daily Tribune reported, Confederate proponents, quote, thrust offensive caricatures of the Federal generals, photographs of the rebel chiefs, and abusive secession songs at the officers of the U.S. troops stationed here as they pass the thoroughfares. Confederate supporters, in other words, built their new nation as they simultaneously mocked their old one through quiet and bold displays of leaders' likenesses. Not surprisingly, famous Southern faces proved especially popular targets for Northern troops. In this vein, Union soldiers took a keen interest in disfiguring Jefferson Davis's likeness. Recounting Sherman's burning of Columbia, South Carolina, for instance, Emma LeConte described how she was, quote, too far off to see much of the tumult, but she did learn that part of the pillage and terror, as she put it, included target practice on Davis's image. I hear they found a picture of President Davis in the Capitol, LeConte noted, which was set up as a target and shot at amid the jeers of the soldiery. LeConte didn't specify the type of picture, though we might suspect that to serve as an adequate bullseye, it was likely a print or a sizable painting rather than a small carte de visite. But whatever the type and size, her story makes clear how the image became the centerpiece of a ritual, of a mock execution, the shared destruction of the political opposition in visual material form, through which Union troops built solidarity. Likewise, when Union soldiers ransacked Jefferson Davis's Mississippi plantation, they made sure to stab his image over and over again with a knife. In these ways, iconoclasm could serve as a brutal political ritual through which Northern soldiers expressed deep-felt anger as well as camaraderie. As Union troops targeted visions of rebel leaders, they also left their mark on familial images in Southern households. Though Northern men sometimes stole these pictures, they also devoted significant energy to destroying them on the spot. From my research so far, it appears that the nature of this destruction could vary greatly. Certain stories detail how troops simply ruined images, like they would destroy any dresser or table that they found in a household. Former slave Lila Nichols, this is in a WPA narrative, recalled how the Yankees snatch pictures from the side of the house and throw them down and break them. Likewise, Kate Stone, who's another kind of famous Civil War Southern diarist, described the fate of her friend's most prized possessions. As Kate Stone tells us, everything else was destroyed by the Yankees. House and furniture burned, piano hacked to pieces, and the portraits torn to shreds. Other white women wrote of family portraits half cut from their frames and cut up in shreds. But it appears that Northern troops also took special aim at the faces and bodies within the frames. One Southern white refugee, for instance, entered a home to find that, as she put it, a family portrait of an old lady was hanging on the wall with a saber cut across her face. Such iconoclasm was part of the broader destructive impulses of the war. Historian Megan Kate Nelson, in a really great book, Ruined Nation, has detailed this devastation, paying particular attention to the ways in which Northerners and Southerners made meaning from ruined cities, natural landscapes, bodies, and household possessions. Nelson notes that Southern women dreaded the loss of household goods, and she speculates that some soldiers may have enjoyed the novelty of destruction. As she writes, the pure adrenaline rush of smashing objects to bits after long days in camp or in the saddle. Nelson further suggests that for other Northern soldiers, the pleasure of such destruction was rooted in the meaning of these objects for Southerners. Further research will help assess what iconoclastic acts meant to Northern troops, as my database right now is primarily composed of Southern whites records. But I want to ask right now about the particularity of iconoclasm in this broader world of wartime destruction. Did iconoclasm serve a more potent form of destruction for both Southerners and Union troops than the blasting of pianos and furniture? Was there something about the portrait, for instance, that made it an especially powerful target? The narratives of Southern white women allow us to access iconoclasm as a social act with emotional consequences and affective meanings. We must consider, however, that these stories about pictures were more than simply stories about pictures. Rather, these stories about iconoclasm represented venues, if you will, for white women to articulate ideas about broader things, ideas about themselves, ideas about their slaves, ideas about Northern troops. Take, for instance, the account of Eliza Ripley, a slaveholding mistress in Louisiana. When Ripley returned to Baton Rouge to tour the city after its Union occupation, she described a visit to Judge Morgan's house. Although Ripley noted how the contents of store closets had been poured over the floors and stressed how molasses and vinegar and everything that defaces and stains had been smeared over walls and furniture, she was especially struck by the fate of the family portraits. And here's part of what she says about them. And I'm giving you a kind of quote heavy talk, if you will, so bear with me, but I wanted to give you as much of their words as possible. The grand portraits, heirlooms of that aristocratic family, men of the Revolutionary period, high-bred dames of a long-past generation in short bodices, puffed sleeves, towering headdresses, and quaint golden chairs. Ancestors long since dead, not only valuable as likenesses that could not be duplicated, but acknowledged works of art. These portraits hung upon the walls, slashed by swords clear across from side to side, stabbed and mutilated in every brutal way. So there's a lot we can say about this quote, this passage. One of the things that we could say is Union iconoclasm for Ripley served as a direct assault on the family. In this case, such an attack was all the more cruel because it harmed not an average family for her, but instead an aristocratic family with roots that stretched back to the Revolution. The subjects of the portraits held such high stature that their pictures even represented acknowledged works of art. Ripley highlighted in this case the status and history of the family as she constructed the war as a violation of the family's ancestors. This is all a way of saying, and I'd be delighted to talk more about this passage and others, but it's all a way of saying that in telling stories about Union iconoclasm, white women such as Ripley detailed the social behavior of Northern soldiers for sure, but they also imagined themselves their enemies and the meanings of the conflict. Enslaved people witnessed Union iconoclasm in Southern households, but Bond's people also engaged in their own striking acts of image appropriation and ruination. And this brings me to the second part of my paper. Perhaps the most dramatic of such instances involved the portraits of Low Country aristocrat and slaveholder Charles Manigault, who described their history at length in his post-war memoirs. In February of 1865, as Manigault tells us, he took his family pictures and shipped them from Charleston to his nearby plantation, Silk Hope, presuming they would be safer from Union troops in a location 40 miles inland from the city. But as Manigault would later describe, something different happened. When our Negroes, before any of the enemy got there, instead of securing or secreting anything of ours, they immediately broke into our dwelling, forced open these boxes, and seized every picture. Some of them they hung up in their Negro houses, while some of the family portraits, as if to turn them into ridicule, they left out, night and day, exposed to the open air. Some of these paintings they sold to anyone who would give a trifle for them. Others they gave away to any of the Negroes who were now strolling through the plantations in the enjoyment of their freedom, and carried them off in their taste for the fine arts. These acts of iconoclasm, commodification, and appropriation were part of the slaves' broader wartime revolt against the Manigault family. This is a revolt that took place across the Manigaux's properties, Silk Hope outside Charleston, another one of their plantations named the Marshlands, and also they have a plantation called Gowrie, which is about 8 miles outside of Savannah. Kind of across the board towards the later years of the war, the enslaved people on these plantations basically take over the plantation estates. Within this context, the story of the Manigault portraits does not end with their initial heist. As Manigault detailed, he had lost control of his plantations, but he was determined not to lose his family pictures. He was undoubtedly most upset about losing his own portrait. Before leaving Philadelphia to travel to China in 1817, he tells us, he sat for this image upon the request of his mother, who, as his mother wanted, wished to have my portrait taken for her to look at during my absence, as she knew not and felt fearful she would not live to see me again. This is a kind of common sentimental rhetoric about both photographs and portraits in the 19th century. But then Manigault goes on. A tongue twister. And he tells us more about this portrait. Tells us a lot about it and his efforts to find it. My own Negro, who had been previously the driver at Silk Hope, or foreman, as the new nomenclature amongst the plantation Negroes is now, and who in former times was, and they are generally supposed to be Negroes of confidence and influence, he seized my portrait as his share of the spoils. After keeping it a little while to ornament his hut, gave it to a Negro woman who was on a visit there, strolling about the country to enjoy her freedom, telling her, as she afterwards informed me, that she must take this portrait home with her to remember him. She did so, and 30 miles from Silk Hope Plantation. With much trouble and some traveling, however, I traced her afterwards and ultimately recovered my portrait, scratched, torn, defaced, so seriously that none but a first-rate artist can restore it. On one level, the narration of these acts allowed many go to decry emancipation and reinforce racial hierarchy in the context of cultural taste. He asserts in condescending fashion that enslaved people were incapable of appreciating the paintings they defaced. Recall in the previous passage, he says, their taste for the fine arts, clearly in condescending fashion. On another level, however, Manigault's story reveals that images served as particularly powerful vehicles for political expression for enslaved people. Though it's impossible to know their rationale, the enslaved people at Silk Hope did, in effect, articulate a breaking point in the social order. This is at the very end of the war, remember, the spring of 1865. They articulated a breaking point in the social order and very likely released much pent-up anger through the very acts of disfiguring, appropriating, and commodifying their masters' portraits. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the event is not the theft or defacement, but instead the way in which the Manigault slaves preserved and exchanged such pictures. Peter, the driver, who Manigault is talking about here, displayed Manigault's likeness to ornament his hut, as Manigault puts it. Peter further exchanged this portrait with a local former slave to remember himself. In doing so, Peter turned the image practices of his former master upside down. Once a sentimental portrait that bound white aristocratic slaveholding mother and son before a long voyage, Manigault's image now enabled two former slaves to maintain ties with each other as they entered emancipation. The exchange of a disfigured portrait of a former slaveholder, scratched, torn, and defaced, helped mark the birth of a new world. While past scholars have characterized the Civil War as a dynamic turning point in the history of American visual culture, this is especially true for historians of photography, we still have much to learn about the role that images played in shaping the politics and culture of this moment. As I conclude, I want to briefly suggest a few ways in which iconoclasm could add a new layer to our story, because it shifts our attention from grasping the influences, the consequences, if you will, of image production, to interpreting the meanings and consequences of image destruction. The study of iconoclasm stands to open up new avenues for understanding the circulation of visual culture, as it reveals the ways in which historical actors, from Union troops to enslaved people in the Manigault plantations, it reveals how they repurposed images, a whole host of images, various types of images. It further stands to enrich our study of reception by illuminating new ways in which images elicited emotions. It provides a venue, in other words, to link the history of visual culture with the emergent history of affect. During the Civil War, iconoclasm undoubtedly served as a political and expressive act. Grappling with this world of image destruction, which I'm just starting to do, I think will mean treating images, whether paintings, prints, or photographs, as material objects with social lives, violent deaths, and multiple afterlives. Thank you.
First of all, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the organizers who put together what has been, I think, a tremendously interesting day of talks. I'm going to begin with an anecdote. Writing in the New York Journal Camera Notes in 1898, Lucius Chittenden looked back on the experience of having his picture taken in 1842, just a few years after the medium was introduced to the public. Of the experience, Chittenden recalled, "The operators rolled out what looked like an overgrown barber's chair. I was seated in the chair, and its Briarean arms seized me by the wrists, ankles, waist, and shoulders. There was an iron bar which served as an elongation of the spine, with a crossbar in which the head rested, which held my head and neck as in a vice. Then, when I felt like a martyr in the embrace of the Nuremberg maiden, I was told to assume my best Sunday expression, to fix my eyes on the first letter of the sign of a beer saloon opposite, and not to move or wink on pain of spoiling the exposure. One of the executioners said I must not close my eyes or move for 10 minutes. The length of that cycle was too awful for description." Chittenden was not unique in characterizing this process as an unpleasant one. Complaints about the photographic pose were commonplace through much of the 19th century, until the late 1880s, when camera manufacturers began to court a mass market of amateur photographers. Most people's portraits were taken in photography studios, and in order for the photographer to capture a good likeness, subjects, who were often referred to as sitters in this period, were required to pose for the camera, assuming a bodily stance and a facial expression that would result in a satisfactory portrait. With this paper, I examined the photographic pose by considering the array of objects that made portrait photographs work, technically by rendering human subjects photographable, but also socially by helping to construct, display, and reiterate the presentable Victorian body. In considering how people of the 19th century practiced and discussed posing, as well as tracing efforts to create the pose, I focus on a few connected varieties of photographic material. First, the posed body as object. Second, furniture intended to guide and shape the pose. And third, accessories that serve to support self-presentation. The photographic pose was bound up with technical necessity, but the nature of its changes over the course of the 19th century suggested its directions both reflected and helped to shape people's understanding of culturally appropriate and revealing self-presentation. Transformations in posing, I argue, were intimately connected with the changing social meaning of the photograph. In early accounts of photographic portraiture, discussions of the pose focused on the stiffness and discomfort that it necessitated. The fact that daguerreotypes, the dominant format for photographic portraiture until about 1860, required subjects to remain stock still for anywhere from several seconds to several minutes, meant that poses were radically limited. Sitters were forced to position their bodies and their faces in such a way that they could ensure they wouldn't flinch or waver. The most successful poses were ones that sitters could maintain with minimal discomfort for long periods of time, and the photographer or other studio employees, more familiar with the tenability of poses, tended to take charge of the sitter's posing or to consult with the sitter to decide which positions would be most suitable. Regardless, posing with perfect stillness was a painful endeavor, and it became commonplace to refer to the sitter as the patient or victim, and the photographer as the operator, or even if one was feeling especially macabre, the executioner. While the pains associated with photography abated somewhat as exposure times quickened, the popular perception of the portrait session as a painful extraction persisted, with commentators speaking of the martyr-like feeling that subjects experience while waiting their turn in front of the camera, and the cast iron appearance that they took on in pictures. It's fitting, then, that the analogies that later observers have most commonly employed to describe daguerreotype sitters and their bodily positions have been those of taxidermy and museum display, a kind of reverse transfiguration that renders living subjects dead. Referring to the lengthy poses sitters were forced to assume in the era of the daguerreotype, Roland Barthes memorably wrote, quote, "Photography transformed subject into object, and even, one might say, into a museum object, a characterization that suggests the almost inhuman stiffness and stillness that the process required." In one portrait taken by the Philadelphia photographer Robert Cornelius in 1842, we see how this played out in practice. The subject is seated, one arm in his lap while the other leans on a side table. He gazes beyond the camera. The overall effect is decidedly catatonic. The body is rigidly posed, right down to the fingers. The mouth and jaw are slack, with lips slightly downturned. The pale eyes look glassy. This bodily position and facial expression were in all likelihood chosen precisely because they could be maintained for the lengthy stretch of time that the camera required. This pose was a popular one because it was considered fail-safe, allowing the body to remain still with arms and legs at rest, while creating a sense of visual interest through the varied positioning of the arms. We see a very similar pose here in this daguerreotype from 1848. And in fact, sorry for the grainy image, a guidebook for photographers written later in this century, Henry Peach Robinson, would cite this pose as the one he was most tired of, saying, quote, "Who does not know and who has not been guilty of this pose, in which the victim appears to be laid out in trust, little round table and all." Standing poses were also commonplace, though they could be more challenging to execute. This portrait by the Boston photographers Southworth and Hawes suggests some of the difficulties. A woman in a black bustled dress poses with remarkable stiffness, though likely this stiffness is partly due to the tight corseting of her gown. The evidence of her difficulty in maintaining this pose is in her face, which is slightly blurred, but especially in the eye that's on our left, which has moved or blinked, and this has resulted in a slight doubling effect if you look closely. Portraits like these tend to give the impression of laying the sitter bare. Lacking much in the way of scenery or accessories, they put the focus squarely on the sitter, and especially on the face. In many respects, this decontextualization and rigidity cohered with mid-19th century ideas about accurate visual representation. The contemporary belief in the legibility of the face as the seat of character, and the tendency of the daguerreotype to offer an exhaustive, unflinching limning of the face, meant that many contemporaries saw the daguerreotype portrait as a reliable indicator of inner temperament. In a representative statement, the daguerreotypist Marcus Aurelius Root asserted that the overriding duty of the photographer was to, quote, "pierce through the oft-times thick mask of the material outward and discern the inner spiritual self," so that the portrait could capture it accurately. Root went on to liken his craft to physiognomy, which was similarly predicated on the legibility of character through the facial features. In many accounts of photography in the mid-19th century, the face, and especially the eyes, were treated as an index of one's inner character, and personal character was at this time a topic of tremendous interest and anxiety. Curiously, though, in order to position the sitter for revealing and putatively transparent photographic representation, a good deal of external maneuvering was required. To create a stable and immobile body and to reduce the likelihood of blurring, physical reinforcements needed to be brought in. Soon, a secondary industry developed to meet this need, with manufacturers selling tools intended to help construct the pose. Early on, these took the form of cast or wrought iron stands with grips to keep the photographic subject's head firmly immobile. These were referred to as posing stands, head supporters, or headrests, a bit more euphemistically. By the late 1840s, these were being advertised as necessaries of the studio, and manufacturers competed to present posing apparatuses with novelty features, like the elegant design of this Jenny Lind headrest. Even as photographers decried the stiffness and the discomfort that was necessary to get a good portrait, and sitters obviously did as well, they often insisted that these devices were obligatory fixtures of the studio. Caricatures in the US and elsewhere lampooned the torturous-looking headrests and those who subjected themselves to it. One such caricature, which appeared in Harper's Weekly in 1859, shows a man seated for his portrait with his head in the vice-like grip of the headrest, while a bearded daguerrean artist instructs him to, quote, "fix your eyes on that painting and assume a pleasing expression of countenance." The painting in question shows a man laden with weapons poised to attack two young girls. The title of the image, "Trying, Very." Another caricature, this one by Daumier, features a gangly bourgeois couple with their heads in the grip of two posing stands, and it mocks the awkwardness of their poses. In order to express the inner self with eloquence, it seems, sitters had to be subjected to the demands of the posing apparatus. The revealing pose needed to be produced through external force. With implements like the headrest, sitters' bodies were trained and guided toward uprightness and stability of the sort that would generate a crisp and unblurred photograph. But the poses that would result in a good photograph were quite distinct from the bodily dispositions that sitters would assume outside the studio, of course, in their everyday lives, where such sustained immobility was not required. So rather than capturing sitters looking as they might in real life, then, the early photographic portrait necessarily molded them into a more photogenic state. By the 1860s, some manufacturers were attempting to overcome the posing stand's reputation as a device that forced sitters' bodies out of lifelike poses, instead proposing items that could adapt to the sitter. A piece in the Illustrated Photographer described a new posing rest that was intended to permit an expanded range of positions. The accompanying illustration showed a man putting it to use, quote, "with a pose decidedly calculated to test its plasticity," This, of course, was fencing. Items like this one suggest a growing interest in reconciling the pose with greater mobility and dynamism. So too did an ever-expanding range of photographic furniture and decorative items that began to emerge around this time, intended to appeal to a taste for novelty and variety among sitters, and to accommodate and mold to sitters' bodies. One such item was the all-in-one, or the universal, a shape-shifting device that was meant to resemble several different items of furniture depending on how it was arranged. This 1869 ad shows a sort of chair lounge hybrid at the top, but below, under the title-changing furniture, it also notes the availability of an item that was simultaneously a lady's writing table, melodeon, dressing stand, bureau, office table, secretary open, secretary closed, bookcase, and sideboard. Also exceedingly common were slips, flat pieces of wood furniture, or flat pieces of wood that were painted to look like furniture items ranging from pianos to fireplaces, and balustrades and columns, often composed, if reports are correct, of paper mache or other such sort of insubstantial items meant to look like more weighty stone furniture. Sitters could sort of drape themselves against these items. As the studio increasingly grew to resemble a stage set, sitters were growing more and more aware of the capacity for photographs to enable canny acts of social performance. During these years, portraiture was becoming a mass medium for the first time, photographic portraiture was becoming a mass medium for the first time, with the rise of the carte de visite, whose reproducibility and cheapness enabled new kinds of social functions for the photograph. Unlike daguerreotypes, which were singular, fairly fragile, and quite expensive, cards could be exchanged with friends and acquaintances, acting as public surrogates for the sitters that they pictured. They were often employed as performative objects, helping to bring about a desired social identity through the visual expression and reiteration of that identity. With the cart, portraits tended to be full figure or three-quarter length shots, showing more of the body than the portraits typical of the daguerreotype period. Implicitly, the whole body rather than merely the face was up for scrutiny. Full-body portraits also permitted new avenues for bodily expression. Sitters could adopt a broader range of poses, don fashionable clothing, and surround themselves with symbolically significant accessories. Obviously, this was not specific to the carte de visite era, but it became, I think, more and more common as this period wore on. When contrasted with earlier portraits, these pictures often give the sense that the emphasis on inner character, so important to the daguerreotype portrait, has been subsumed by style. That identity is no longer purely a matter of the face, but can be suggested by one's attitude, clothing, and surroundings. In a sense, the seat of individuality moves outward, residing less in the face that one was born with than in the things that one poses with. Posing furniture, intended to prop sitters into a state of solidity and immobility, did not disappear from the photography studio, though increasingly rapid exposure times in this period meant that some of the more extreme examples, like the headrest, were not as necessary as they had once been. But a new variety of prop became commonplace, the accessory that served as an external supplement to the physical body, rather than a means of guiding it into the appropriate position. The former implement sought to stabilize the body with the belief that this would express the inner self. The latter was born of a creeping acknowledgement that the face itself might not be sufficient to express identity. The guileless facial expressions and close detail of daguerreotype portraits tended to be unsuitable to the carte de visite. The image quality of the carte portrait could not provide such intricacy, but intricacy was not demanded of these images. Instead, portraiture began to favor modes of expression that allowed subjects to show themselves to the world in impactful, easily legible ways. This often meant hewing to and reinforcing existing identity categories. Photographers often spoke of the need for harmony between the photographed subject and their surroundings, and this harmony drew on expectations connected with gender, age, and occupation. One commentator advised that while men should pose with a column, which suggested an exterior view, women were better suited to domestic items like chairs or curtains. Others noted that intellectual men could be photographed with books. Hunters could pose with implements of the chase, but for women, items like flowers, fans, and yellow-tinted letters would serve. If accessories became conventionalized, so were the poses that sitters tended to adopt. While some photographers began to let sitters pose themselves, many photographers simply imposed the same set of stock positions on all of their sitters, and the photographic trade journals are full of complaints about this. One commentator wrote, quote, "It becomes almost painful to see the same thing monotonously repeated in the portraits of a number of friends." Portraits of two brothers, dating to the 1860s, demonstrate the challenges of differentiation within these confines. Both brothers wear the same, seemingly a police uniform, as they sit in an identical studio setting. They employ the same accessories, their police hats and their blotter booklets. The brother on the left looks alert and attentive, leaning forward, elbow on the desk, hat on his head, eyes focused beyond the frame. The brother on the right appears more relaxed, leaning back with his legs crossed, face distant and aloof. While the conventions of the studio did not altogether determine the ways people presented themselves before the camera, the freedom that they offered in this period was decidedly limited. An uncut sheet of carte de visite images taken by the French photographer Disciplinary, who actually introduced the carte de visite format, illustrates one range of possibilities and hints at the performative nature of the enterprise. The varied exposures of this subject give the sense that he is trying on different personas. In this period, portrait photographs became means of signaling social belonging and privileged sites for the exercise of socially acquired gestures and positions. These bodily techniques were shaped by what Marcel Mauss would later call prestigious imitation, the emulation of the movements and gestures of people in positions of social authority. If the social nature of gesture and bodily comportment was subtle but discernible in everyday life, it was concentrated in the carte de visite portrait, where sitters' own bodily techniques were combined with, and sometimes overruled by, photographers' ideas about socially appropriate pose. By the 1890s, discussions of posing increasingly characterized the very presence of the discernible pose as a problem. There were widespread calls for photography that would be naturalized into the life beyond the frame, with the camera becoming a more seamless, less visible part of the photographic process. Almost inevitably, these calls drew on an imprecise discourse of artifice and naturalness. In these accounts, artifice tended to come in the form of the sitter's excessive concentration on the act of posing. In the eyes of many observers, sitters' acute awareness of being photographed virtually ensured that the portrait would have an ersatz quality. The New York-based photographer Napoleon Sarony articulated this well in 1895, saying, quote, "The art of posing is in not posing. The true pose is not a pose, but a natural position. Once conscious of the camera's presence, presumably, the sitter begins to pose, and falsely." Another commentator 2 years later suggested, quote, "As regards posing, the golden rule seems to be to do none, or as little as possible." What was often recommended as a corrective was distraction. Photographers were advised to divert the sitter's attention away from the camera and towards some other object of interest by engaging them in conversation or giving them an item on which they could focus their attention, like some knitting, a pipe and some matches, or even a paint palette and brushes. In other instances, studio owners provided distraction and levity in the form of an animal. Trained canaries were an accessory of many studios, and for photographers who did not want to have to deal with a live bird, some sellers of photographic equipment also started carrying the American songster, a fake bird that was painted bright colors and could move its beak and sing. Stuffed cats and living monkeys, apparently, were also used by photographers to similar ends, if contemporary accounts are to be trusted. Supposedly, these items reduced the artifice of the photographic encounter by distracting sitters from the camera's presence and allowing them to behave as they might outside of the studio when they weren't so focused on the act of posing. If the accessories of the studio had initially served to express one's identity according to popular expectations, they took on new life in the 1880s and 90s by helping to produce a putative naturalness in the sitters who wielded them. By virtue of shifting cultural mores as well as emerging technological possibilities, the moment was ripe for the increasingly common statements about the artifice and the unnaturalness of posing. T.J. Jackson Lears has observed that in this period, particularly among the American middle class, quote, "reality itself began to seem problematic, and many Americans felt, quote, a yearning to experience intense real life in all its forms," end quote. Transformations in the nature of work, particularly the growth of jobs demanding extensive human interactions, meant that it was increasingly necessary to leave others with a good impression of oneself, and this cultivation of an outward-facing personality tended to erode the idea that the self was a static, solid, uniform entity. Increasing urbanization and the attendant necessity of encountering legions of strangers made it necessary to pass judgments based on fleeting impressions, or more necessary anyway, but also led to new anxieties about the trustworthiness of surface appearances. Within this context, Max Weber spoke about the rationalization of society, asserting that a bureaucratic society's valuing of dispassionate efficiency and calculability, what he called a spirit of formalistic impersonality, led to a flattening of subjective experience and individual agency. In many respects, the intransigently rooted selfhood that early photographic portraiture emphasized was being contested by an understanding of the personality as a commodity, something potentially unstable, contingent, and socially constructed. Yet for many in the late 19th century, this was a troubling development. With this in mind, the outmoding of posing in photography can be interpreted as a rejection of cultural values that were coming to be pretty widely contested by the American middle class toward the end of the 19th century. If the daguerreotype portrait had been premised on a positivist belief in the camera's capacity to access the subject's inner moral character, and if the carte de visite was emblematic of a period in which sitters were coming to understand and exploit the nature of social identity as something constructed and performative, then the rejection of the post-portrait suggests a disenchantment with the innumerable sources of bureaucratization and regimentation that characterized late 19th century existence. If the late Victorian period saw a growing suspicion toward the prevalence of false fronts, of social facades, then it also saw attempts to recuperate the repressed, authentic self, an eagerness to dig below the pale exterior and exhume a more vital, honest sensibility that was believed to be just under the posed surface. Yet there was a certain circularity to this imperative. Much like the earlier faith in the legibility of character in the daguerreotype portrait, the growing enthusiasm for the unposed image was predicated on a belief that the photograph could offer privileged access to one's inner self. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you both for these terrific papers. Let me spend a few minutes with a few observations prompted by Matt's and Annie's talks about photographs, and especially portraiture, their uses and abuses, rituals, and appropriations. These brief remarks will not do justice to all of the insights and implications in these two rich papers, but I want to draw out one or two aspects that might inform our larger discussion about, in the case of this session, the material turn in the study of 19th century visual culture. Turning to Matt's Civil War Iconoclasm, Mary Boykin Chestnut's story about young Mr. Haynes' response to Lincoln's carte de visite reminded me of a similar assault in another Civil War diary, which I expect Matt is familiar with. This one by another Eliza Frances Andrews in Georgia in August 1865. And at that time, she experienced her own iconoclastic battle. And this is a brief quote. That's not the quote, but it refers to the quote. She wrote the following: "The pictures in Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's tell more lies than Satan himself was ever the father of. I get in such a rage when I look at them that I sometimes take off my slipper and beat the senseless paper with it. No words can express the wrath of a Southerner on beholding pictures of President Davis in a woman's dress," remember this is 1865, "and Lee, that star of light before which even Washington's glory pales, crouching on his knees before a beetle-browed image of Columbia, suing for pardon." In fact, that's the picture she was looking at, which is a Thomas Nast cartoon. Now, Eliza Andrews certainly testified to the use of portraits as weapons that Matt discusses, but to identify some of the sources of the wartime iconoclasm Matt notes, I wonder if we should look back as far as the 1840s and the extended and escalating struggle between abolitionist and pro-slavery images. It was a struggle that prompted a general suspicion of images and image makers, epitomized by British artist Eyre Crow's confrontation when sketching a Richmond, Virginia slave market in 1855, meticulously studied by Maury McGinnis in her outstanding book, Slaves Waiting for Sale. And as secession mounted in 1861, the confiscation of Harper's Weekly artist Theodore Davis's drawings by Memphis vigilantes, as just two examples. But the pictorial struggle, as identified by Eliza Andrews, was perhaps most aggressively fought over faces, over portraits, or sort of portraits, specifically contending caricatures, a veritable explosion of negative physiognomies that mounted in numbers and varieties after the introduction of the carte de visite, and the resulting proliferation and fixation on pictures of famous faces, caricatures relying to be in any way successful on the widespread ability of viewers to identify illustrious and notorious faces. So, with Union troops' attacks on idealized portraits of Confederate leaders and prominent figures in mind, perhaps their iconoclastic acts stemmed in part from, or were oriented by, a generation of vituperative portraiture in the North's visual print culture. Annie's Posing a Problem delineates the changing gadgets, furniture, rituals, processes, and conventions of portrait photography, which together helped construct and display, in Annie's phrase, the presentable Victorian body. I'm curious if Annie has come across techniques and approaches to taking a likeness that might have been considered more fail-safe than the ceremonies, contraptions, and other items and methods enlisted in capturing the visual essence of character or status. The properties of the wet plate process and reproducible carte de visite seem particularly well suited for manipulations beyond the realm of the exposure and darkroom. This is pure conjecture, but collage-like cartoons, particularly during the Civil War, combining photos and tonal art, suggest the sort of enhanced constructions or reconstructions of likenesses that could be offered by portrait studios. As do satiric commentaries such as this 1858 Frank Leslie's two-panel cartoon captioned on the left, a photograph as it appears untouched, and then, on the right, the same after being retouched by the artists. Cartoons that joked about a supplementary ritual in the portrait process. Following Annie's argument, photography manuals might be considered a part of or ancillary to the ubiquitous 19th century etiquette manuals and prescriptive and proscriptive literature in general, laying down recommendations and strictures about proper behavior and appearance in the home and while navigating the unreliable outside world of strangers. And much like the etiquette manuals, we might ask if the photographic manuals implicitly indicate a fair amount of resistance to their posing rules and conventions, or certainly perpetual violations. After all, are manuals necessary when everyone is obedient? With that in mind, are there situations where the conventions and rituals of portrait photography were defied or appropriated, or alternatives were devised? Anthony Lee offers an example in A Shoemaker's Story, his study of photography and industrialization and immigrant workers, presenting the self-fashioning of poses and accessories in Chinese worker portraits in North Adams, Massachusetts in the 1870s. So those are my brief remarks, and now we'll turn it over to you. Thank you. So do you have any comments you want to have first or responses?
Actually, and maybe it's not much of a contribution, but I was also thinking about photo montage during Matt's presentation, and thinking also about the idea that, you know, this also is a sort of, you know, slicing of the image, a cutting of the image, and, you know, much like the accounts by the Southern women who occupied the domestic sphere, so have sort of a privileged position to look at and recount these acts of violence. You know, photo collage in many cases is sort of another domestic practice, one that is not seen as sort of violent in its intentions for the most part, but is sort of perceived, I think, as a creative act. But I also just wanted to sort of echo that connection.
Yeah.
So my question's for Matt, and I'm going to try to phrase it so it makes sense to everyone else and not just in my head. So I'm thinking of, Union soldiers destroying these portraits, and I'm thinking of other ways in which Southern women, especially in occupied cities, used objects as sort of tools of war. So they used their clothing, they used things like Jeff Davis bonnets, they had buttons they would make with Confederate generals, they would wear mourning clothing when they were being occupied, all to kind of show there's just pleasure that these soldiers were around. And so I'm thinking of objects as sort of tools of war, and I'm wondering, do you get a sense if they're upset because the portraits are being destroyed by Union soldiers, or if there's some sort of sense of identity or normalcy or something like that that's being destroyed? So for example, have you looked into are refugees taking their portraits with them when they're fleeing? Or do the portraits sort of denote a sort of homage to your heritage, something that's personally important, or are they just angry because Union soldiers are destroying it?
I'm trying to work through this question right now, and my initial sense is there is a particularity to images and especially portraits. I mean, they write I would suggest most, if not all, Southern white women's diaries, memoirs from the war, will talk about this household destruction. And they'll write at length, and they'll list sometimes the objects that were destroyed. The piano is always one of them, furniture, these sorts of things. They always seem to be the most upset about the images.
Yeah, I was wondering, are they more upset over the portraits than the silver being taken, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult in some ways to address degrees of upsetness, but if we think of that Ripley passage where she's talking about the heirlooms and how these are works of art, I do get a sense that there's something about, they're thinking in some ways about the person and the image, and it's not in some ways simply a representation. There's something more about the portrait to them, and so it really bothers them when a face is slashed, because it feels like an attack on that person, which I think is in some ways different from other forms of material culture. That said, I don't want to go too far with that argument, because certainly silver could have been given as a gift and it could be related to the person. But I do think there is something about the body that's different for them.
My question's for Annie. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the issue of agency and how it's working in at least 3 different groups in what you've presented. So I was really interested in the early caricatures, because that shows people, so sitters, critiquing the way that photographers work. And then it seemed like at the later end of the 19th century, a lot of what you were showing was photographers kind of critiquing sitters in that, we have to distract them because they're like so fake, and like you can't like let them pose themselves because they're gonna mess it up or whatever. And then of course the third kind of element of agency that you kind of discussed throughout is the furniture or the set itself. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit more just about how you've been working through that idea.
Right, yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I think that, in terms of the distinction between the caricatures of the photography studio as this sort of unpleasant process, it seems that to a large extent the sort of transition from these accounts where the studio is being mocked and the studio is seen as this sort of painful place to sitters themselves being the problem, bespeaks sort of a growing internalization of what photography means, what it means to be photographed, how common it is. It simply, becomes something that I think people are a lot more used to by the time that there is this sort of call for naturalness. So I think that's part of it. And then related to the discussion of sort of the objects of the studio as having a certain agency, I think that, this also is sort of connected with the growing, internalization, acceptance of the photographic process. Because people become more aware of the conventions. People are, at least, especially by the 1860s, people are looking at photographs, very frequently. They're surrounded by lots of them. They become a mass medium. And so people, I think, become a lot more conscious of sort of the cliches that exist, that sort of characterize a lot of popular photography. And I think that, speaking more practically, photography becomes less painful. There's less need for the headrest, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg or whatever was referred to in the first slide. So it becomes a little bit less like going to the dentist. But I think that in the background of all of this, and it's something that I didn't have time to talk about during my presentation, is the emergence in the late 1880s onward of snapshot photography, and the idea that there is now this way to take photographs that are, putatively more natural. To use a word that they all love to use, that you don't have to pose. You can actually just catch someone unawares, and that's what some of my other research deals with. So there is now this sort of perceived deficiency in the photograph that needs to be posed in the studio that wasn't really present before.
Yeah, just as a follow-up question, but is there not also, and the snapshot creates this, a distinction still with the formal portrait?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is something that continues forward, the formal portrait having significance that the snapshot doesn't.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the snapshot, I mean, and I think this has a lot to do, not to offer too much of a sort of techno-determinist idea, but to, with the necessity of firms like Eastman Kodak needing to sell large quantities of film, and so in stating the photograph as something that you do every day, as a sort of hobby, as a record of quotidian life, rather than an account of the special occasions. So there are sort of different varieties of photography. There's still formal portraits. They tend to be at occasions like weddings or baptisms, or maybe not baptisms, but when a baby is born, things like that. But then there's also this sort of ubiquitous quotidian photography that emerges as well, that is allowed to be a bit more informal.
This is a question for Matt. I'm interested in the responses of the Southern white elites, especially, or just Southern whites, to the iconoclasm that you talk about. So what do they do with these destroyed objects? Do they embrace them as relics? Do they try to? I got the sense that in one case they might try to restore a painting. It seems to me, especially when we were reading the Eliza Ripley account, it's kind of classically lost cause rhetoric, where she's kind of wallowing in the sorrow and the debasement, the degradation that is so undeserved in her mind. But the next step ultimately is a kind of redemption, and so they find a way to redeem these objects. And if so, like, how do they do that? And just to throw one more layer, how is it different when they're visual as well as material?
Yeah, those are great questions. I completely agree that in that rhetoric we can see or intertwining ideas about the family and the demise of the family with broader rhetoric about the demise of the South. Definitely. So there's the rhetorical point. In terms of socially what they do, I'm trying to think in my head of the examples I have. The best might be the Manigault instance, in which he writes 2 or 3 times in his memoirs about the same instance, but in different ways. So right there, it's important. And he will talk about how he needs to get these fixed. And he doesn't really describe what he does past bringing them back to artists to see if they can be fixed. I don't know how representative he is. My sense would be that he is fairly representative, just based on the emotional reactions that you see across the board to these paintings. But I couldn't say much more than that right now.
Well, just if I could press that, and maybe you can't answer this question, but it would be really interesting to know, especially if you could follow in his memoir, how the extent to which he reevaluated his portrait after it was restored, and whether, clearly it means something different after it's defaced and then recovered than it meant beginning. So it has a kind of a new life or a new meaning potentially. That would be really interesting to find out, or to try to discern and see if that follows into other sorts of redemptions and of other objects and their transformation into what I would call relics.
Yeah, that's a great research question. I think from the passages right there, I would say initially that it ends up being this mix of sentiment and betrayal. He's talking about how he feels these enslaved people have betrayed him so much by doing this.
Super papers, both of you. I also had a question for Matt, but first I will tell you I tweeted at Megan Kate Nelson that you cited Ruination. She said, "Fabulous, love Matt, very jealous you got to hear this talk." So thought I'd pass that on. A little encouragement from the Twitterverse.
Tell Megan I said hello.
I will. After our exchange here. My question was, I was completely fascinated that it seems as though portraits are getting more ire directed towards them than photographs. Because I was discussing with Wendy Bellion, her new project, I don't know if you had a chance to discuss this with her, about the first American Civil War and destruction of the statue of King George III.
Yeah.
And I was asking her, what's your opinion as an art historian and someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about this, about why sculptures in particular raise this particular ire, right? And we were discussing all these elements about accurately depicting the body and being a good stand-in for the human being, et cetera, et cetera. But your talk has me thinking, if that's the case, why not attack the photographs more than the portraits, right? Because the photographs are more viscerally like the person.
Yeah.
And so what I'm wondering now is if you think that it could be the space in which these things are placed. So in other words, the statues, it's because this is where people congregate and they see these things en masse, and so if they're going to take a mob action, this makes sense. But in the case of the portraits, enslaved people have been forced to labor under the watchful gaze of these things, dust the frames, etc. I wonder if you think it's a sort of, if it's as much about the space in which the things are located as the things themselves.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's about the space. I mean, I completely agree that I don't think it's about verisimilitude or accuracy. I think it's in part about the space, and this is going to differ in terms of enslaved people versus Union troops. Enslaved people have been looking at these images every day. Union troops, it's the first time. But either way, it is the household. I think it's about the size. I mean, these accounts don't talk very much about how big the images are. But my guess is they're big portraits, painted portraits. I think that's part of it. And then I think the last thing is the value. I think the monetary value, I'm going to say, actually, I think two more things. One is the monetary value of the paintings versus a photograph, which is very cheap. And then I think the last thing is the materiality of the image, the way in which they can actually slice a painting. For a photograph, they're going to have to break it, or if it's a carte de visite, they're going to have to tear it. But I think that doesn't leave the same kind of shock and awe behind that the, never thought I would use that phrase, but I'm thinking especially of the Union troops. They're not leaving behind the kind of same ruin with a photograph as they are with a big portrait on the wall that's been slashed down the middle. These are speculations, but that's all.
I think also, though, that the materiality matters because of the durability, right? That's precisely why they're not, I think, attacking the photographs, because these are testimonies to families, aristocratic lineages, right?
Yeah.
So the Union soldiers are going to be motivated to attack these because these are the ones that are going to endure, just like the sculptures are going to endure and have endured and testified to something that they fought the war for, in the first place. But I also think the spaces thing is fantastic because you can see in his language that, was it Manago or, right? He calls it, you can just feel that, on his spine that this is being displayed in a hut. He calls it a hut, right?
Yeah.
This is what's bothering him about it, so.
Yeah, and there's certainly a racial dimension here, but there's also a class dimension to the extent that many northern troops coming south might never had enough money to buy a painting, whereas everyone can get a photograph. And for enslaved people too, in my book I have a chapter about enslaved people themselves, both obtaining and buying their own photographs, but they don't have the money to get a painting for sure.
I was just thinking about two, as you were speaking, two different categories of material culture that might sort of play in. One was popularity of actress cards, theatrical cards generally, in terms of presenting an array of poses and costumes, and the idea of play and sort of performance. I don't know if that would also influence the way people are thinking about how they want to be represented in portrait photography. And then I was also just thinking about a talk I heard at CAA this year on portrait by Archibald Motley in the 1920s of his grandmother with the portrait of her former owner. And it was really interesting talk about how she kept this portrait with her. When she left the plantation, her owner gave her this portrait to remember her. And I guess there's some interesting things there about Archibald Motley sort of pulling it out to hang on the wall to make a portrait of her. Anyway, I thought that was just an interesting thing. Of course, it's from 1920, but it's still harkening kind of back to that. The fact that she traveled around with it, I thought was sort of interesting. But the word I was thinking about was catharsis in terms of stabbing a painting. You know what I mean? That act that substitutes in that moment for any visceral kind of, or it is a visceral empowerment, but in a way it's a substitute for really turning the tables on the power structure, or at least as things play out. But that moment of destruction had to feel great.
Yeah.
That was
I don't know if you want to go first or.
Sure, I can just respond quickly. So in terms of the theatrical portraits, and especially with the rise of the carte de visite, I think you're absolutely right that they're a really important influence, especially as, you know, this is a medium where people can, you know, collect this, as I think you indicated in your presentation, collect portraits of famous people, of celebrities, of sort of stars of the stage and politicians, and sort of put them in the same albums that they put portraits of their friends and family members. So there's a kind of parody being suggested here. I think that, you know, theatrical portraits quite often just sort of offer a kind of more intensely theatrical version of the kinds of presentation that often exist in carte de visite of normal people, meaning non-famous people, I guess. Yeah, so I mean, I think it depends a lot. Like, you know, in many theatrical portraits, people are sort of in costume or are sort of meant to sort of represent a particular sort of character. Talked a lot about caricature today. And so, you know, but in some respects, what people are doing in their carte de visite, they're just of them, you know, whoever they are, normal people, they're trying to do the same thing. They're sort of putting an identity out there with sort of the hope that it will stick, that people will see it as, in this sort of more public and circulatory medium than earlier photographs had been, and sort of hoping that it, you know, it sort of gets the message across of what they would like to present to people. And often it doesn't really work. Like, and this I think goes sort of back to your earlier question that, you know, there's a sort of distance between how people want to present themselves to the world and how they actually come off. And you often sort of see this in diaries and accounts of people looking through the albums of others and saying, oh, you know, that's not really anything like them. Yeah, you know, that's very flattering. So it's not always as convincing as people sort of hope it will be.
Was there something else you wanted to say?
Well, I was going to, and there were two different comments there, and for your comment, I'm fascinated to learn this Archibald Motley instance. And I think one of the things that Iconoclasm allows us to understand better is we talk about appropriation, but this is more than appropriation. Mm-hmm. It's an act of ownership or possession over someone else by taking their image and doing what you want with it. And I think catharsis, or thinking about it as cathartic, is a useful framework. I mean, I found as I just started to write about this that I don't feel like I have a language to describe what's going on when these people are destroying images. I was actually talking to a friend who said that she has a friend who, when he begins his history of photography class, he asks his students to bring in a family portrait, a photographic portrait. They bring it in the next class, and apparently he asks them to tear the portrait in half. And even as I say, I think, oh, would I do that? I don't know. I mean, there's a kind of like, there's a sort of irrational, like I feel like there is something about the person in the image. And Bart talks about this a lot. And Bart talks a lot about, you know, a portrait of his mother, and you know, and there's something more than just a representation there. And so there's something going on there. And I think undoubtedly, especially for the enslaved people, it must have. I mean, there's a kind of felt. It just must have felt so good to be able to take these portraits and tear them and do as well with them.
Well, I think more broadly speaking, censorship in general feels really good in the moment. Right? I don't like that speech stuff, but it doesn't necessarily change anything. It actually almost never changes anything, but it feels really good in the moment.
Yeah,
And that that's a version of, you know, a form of cultural regulation.
Yeah, I mean, there is the kind of like, well, is this just a safety valve? Is this not really? I don't think I'm as interested in the kind of, you know, long-term political consequences of iconoclasm as I just am in trying to understand what's happening in this moment.
Can I argue
You've been,
with
you've
this for
been,
just
you've
a
been, I'm
minute?
sorry,
Sorry.
you've been waiting for.
Oh, thank you.
I
I just
really-
wanted to make
I
a very,
just- I
very
can't.
quick comment. My comment was just that the word that I think that you're looking for is dehumanization. So in other words, in order to kill, and they had to go in and kill fellow Americans, basically, they had to dehumanize them. So that's part of war, and I think it's part, and to make fun of people. So I was actually thinking, since yesterday was Holocaust Memorial Day, and I had seen a lot of things on Facebook yesterday, and two things that had come up to my mind. One is that when Jews had come into Auschwitz, for instance, the one thing they had tried to preserve the whole time was a photograph of family members. So they kept it in a shoe or they kept it in some way. And then oftentimes Germans, if they found them, would rip them up. So that's one thing. It's a completely different context, but I wanted to bring that up. And also that they made fun of them, and you showed the outfits and the putting a man in a woman's outfit or whatever. So for instance, they had musicians who were Jewish musicians who were to perform for the Germans, but in order to make them not human, not like themselves, they put them in outfits of clowns. They had big bows, and I'd never heard this. They had created these costumes for them. So they're performing, but they're to be looked at as not us. So in other words, when you're having these people come in from the north into the south, and it's a completely different context, and so I don't even like fully making the comparison, but if you try to make the person human or you try to stab the painting, then you could stab the person.
Kathy, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you before. You wanted to say something?
Oh, I was just going to argue a little bit and push back and say that it seems to me that if you, I'll just put this out there boldly and baldly, it seems to me that if you want to get at what iconoclasm is about in the Civil War, it's not in the image itself, but the primal act of stabbing an image, primal as it may be. That's something that happens a lot. And in the stories that you're telling, it seems to me that there are essentially two stories. One is the sort of the brief story that you skittered over at the beginning with the public political taunting the troops in a space that is out of doors, that's in the public, that's a political and military situation that's associated with all kinds of things. And you can find antecedents to that, you know, going back to the revolution, famously with the toppling of the statue of King George and Bowling Green. But it seems to me that if you want to get at what is distinctive about this, it's not the paintings and it's not whether they're photographs, it's the situation. It's the domesticity of where these things are displayed. It dovetails with all kinds of transformations in understanding about who is political, what can be political, what counts as a legitimate political target. I mean, I don't think it's as taken as I am by the I don't think that's it. I think that what it is the larger built environment, if we want to stay on that terrain of what's happening and the element of home invasion or whatever. But the way that that dovetails and intersects with a sea change in politics between, say, 1776 and 1860, and it's just ideas about political rights, political subjectivity, and all of that. So that's where I'm just arguing back. That's what I think. That's what stands out to me in that.
Versus it being about the particularity of one type of image versus another.
I mean, I think that the anguish is, you know, nobody wants to see their face cut up or their mother's face cut up. But if you zoom out and you think about, if you go back to the question that you began with, what is it about it in iconoclasm in the Civil War? It's that. It's the expansive, elastic notion of what can become a political target for iconoclasm. And I think that's what is jumping out at me.
Yeah.
That's what doesn't look like revolutionary or iconoclasm.
Yeah.
Expecting.
Yeah, I think we're there's something that I feel has to be said. It's like a rape. I mean, the description of I can't remember who it was by, the slashing of the painting of the woman and the ancestors and the bodices and so on. I mean, it's there in that description that it's a rape and that it's an act, it's part of war, and I think that's implicit in a lot of these reported acts of, we're calling iconoclasm, and I don't think we should overlook it.
I would just beat to death what I said earlier. I think that, to sort of maybe extend Kathy's point, this has been going on for 20 years. I mean, in other words, in the sense that 1865, certainly since the mid-1840s, postal bans on images. There's an image war, and there's a proliferation of images also. I mean, this is, I think, the environment, at least in the North, sort of thing, is you're drowning in images, and many of the, of course, pro-slavery images are Northern images. So it's just another thought that this is part of the sea change that has taken place, is that, of course, the sectional crisis has been going on, not, only, 1 year or 2 years or 4 years of war, but going on for a generation. Yes.
Okay. I keep wondering about the word iconoclasm and the word vandalism, and they bring two long histories of associations with them. And I mean, in the context of the Revolutionary War, there was this public political destruction. There's also hanging an effigy.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
the destruction of art is almost sometimes becomes another aspect of attacking the body of a leader.
That just prompts, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and with iconoclasm, well, that goes back to a religious root.
Yeah.
A colleague of mine, that's her specialty now. She's going around and photographing scratched out faces on Renaissance painting and looking for patterns. She finds that people were usually scratching out the faces of the devils and the bad guys, because this was an act of piety. But what goes into it is, that the image has power almost as an avatar of what it represents. And that may be very true in the Southern families. But I'm just wondering if, thinking about the roots of the word iconoclasm and thinking how well does it apply or doesn't it apply to the situation you're working on, it might be illuminating.
Yeah, I'll have to do more on that. I mean, I will have to also ask you about your friend's work and whatnot. I do really like David Friedberg's work on iconoclasm and the power of images, and there is very much talking about it in a religious context. I think religion is at play here, though my framework right now is a kind of secular, people who are hitting and destroying images. That's what I'm thinking about. And so maybe iconoclasm at the end of the day isn't the best word to describe that if it immediately connotes a religious context. I'm only trying to get first at the violence done to images and then incorporate religion as I need to.
Or possibly understanding how it signifies almost anthropologically in the religious context will help you add more layers to how it signifies, within the shrine of the home or the shrine of the ancestors or whatever it's doing there.
I'm afraid that I'm going to have to draw things to a close. The clock in the audience is letting me know. We must close. But this has been as all the other panels, a very rich conversation, and thank you for the papers. Thank you.